Well, I know this has nothing to do with gaming, but screw it. It's Christmas and I feel like telling a Christmas story. And so gather around the computer or phone and come listen to good old Game Steal in History recount the tale of the Christmas Truce. Let's go to Christmas Eve over 100 years ago and the trenches of 1914. The Great War has been raging for 5 long months, and almost everyone had believed that the war would be over within a couple of weeks. No one believed that it would go on past Christmas, and so, sitting in the trenches, many of the soldiers were singing hymns, sometimes towards each other, sometimes just with each other. On Christmas Day, they had their church service, and they had their special gifts from loved ones, but they didn't necessarily want to keep killing each other. There was some kind of air of good nature along with many of the soldiers. Now, the officers, the high-ranking ones, wanted no such truce. They didn't want one at all because they were afraid of fraternization. Now, see, what a lot of the high-ranking military officers on both sides of the war were afraid of was that if you get complacent and become friends with your enemy, which was a real concern because a lot of times trenches were just a couple feet away from each other, that you wouldn't necessarily want to shoot the guy that you had become friends with. And so, no Christmas truce was supposed to happen. But many soldiers still went over the trenches on Christmas morning and shook hands with each other. They simply talked. Many of them were trading buttons, and there was even a recorded football game. Some say that the British won by 4-1, and there's other counts depending on how the score goes and whatnot, but I'm sure, depending on who was telling the tale, they embellished the details just a bit to make the British look like they won. I have some quotes from different soldiers, and, well, mainly 2, and these accounts read as, "I wouldn't have missed that unique and weird Christmas day for anything. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant, I should think, and being a bit of a collector, I intimidated him, and had taken fancy to some of his buttons. I brought out the wire clippers that I had, and with a few deft snips, removed a couple of his buttons and put them in my pocket. I then gave him 2 of mine in exchange. Last I saw was one of my machine gunners, who was a bit of an amateur hairdresser in civil life, cutting the unnaturally long hair in the docile Bach, who was patiently kneeling on the ground whilst the automatic clippers crept along the back of his neck." Yes, there were reports of hairdressers coming out and cutting people's hair. I was even watching the Great War channel, and he gave an account of a juggler who came out and gave a little show in the middle of no man's land. Another account I have includes Friday, Christmas Day. We're having the most extraordinary Christmas Day imaginable. A sort of unarranged and quite unauthorized, but perfectly understood and scrupulously observed truce exists between us and our friends in front. The funny thing is, it only seems to exist in this part of the battle line. On our right and left, we can hear them firing away as cheerfully as ever. The thing started last night, a bitter cold night with white frost. Soon after dusk, when the Germans started shouting, "Merry Christmas, Englishmen," to us. Of course our fellows shouted back, and presently, large numbers of both sides had left their trenches, unarmed, and met in the debatable, shot-riddled no-man's land between the lines. Here the agreement, all on their own, came to be made that we should not fire at each other until after midnight tonight. The men were all fraternizing in the middle. We naturally did not allow them too close to our line, and swapped cigarettes and lies in the utmost good fellowship. Not a shot was fired all night. See, another thing that happened with soldiers is the Germans would get sausages and cheeses a lot of times, while the British would get cigarettes and, depending on what that country had. And in the middle, they would exchange their gifts, a lot of times bringing out wallets and whatever they had, showing off pictures of loved ones at home and telling stories and swapping. But another thing you hear in this one quote saying is, "only in our line." See, this was a very unofficial truce, and so certain points of the line, this was happening. But in other points of the line, it was not so friendly. Occasionally people shouted and sang hymns, but no one crossed. And some parts of the line, people thought there was an actual truce, and when they crossed no man's line, they were shot on sight, which is quite the shame. The last quote I have comes from the last surviving veteran at the time, who was a Scottishman who fought for Britain. And he wrote, "I remember the silence, the eerie sound of silence. Only the guards were on duty. We all went outside the farm buildings and just stood listening, and of course thinking of people back home. All I'd heard for 2 months in the trenches was the hissing, cracking, and whining of bullets in the flight, machine gun fire, and distant German voices. But there was a dead silence that morning. Right across the land, as far as you could see, We shouted Merry Christmas, and even though nobody felt merry, the silence ended early in the afternoon and the killing started again. It was a short peace in a terrible war. So many historians and many people would say that this truce wasn't anything more importantly. See, there was a type of thing, and I don't remember the name for it, but essentially it was the Germans would make sure not to shell you, or shell the positions where you would have tea and crumpets and whatnot, and you would make sure not to shell the German outhouses or the time that they would eat. And slowly you built this regiment of when you would shell and when you would shoot each other, and when you would do that. And some people say this Christmas truce was simply that, another moment of this kind of scheduling that was happening. And a Christmas truce like this wouldn't happen again because the officers would become far more strict with each other. The war would become uglier as chemical weapons were being introduced, and fraternization was being faced with far more threatening terms, and night raids were occurring more often, specifically to stop this level of fraternization, lest you become friends with your enemy. Me and lots of other people say that it shows the power of Christmas, and how even in war, enemies can show signs of peace and humanity. And looking back on it, from a modern perspective into that era, and into that year, we can look at it and say, or at least think to ourselves, that it was a moment of good spirit. And perhaps we can learn from this moment that Christmas is about helping everyone. It is being friendly to everyone. And even in the worst moments, it's still Christmas. And there's still people that love you. And it's still just a good old time. I hope you enjoyed this story of the 1914 Christmas truce. And if you want to learn more, Sainsbury did a pretty good commercial actually based off it. I'll put a link in the description. And if you want to see a very detailed explanation of the 1914 Christmas truce, go check out the Great War channel, being held by Indy Nidell. I'll put a link in the description as well. And Merry Christmas. I hope it's good for you.